For tonight's homework, you're going to be solving equations on page 13. Hopefully you've had a chance to try to solve some of those equations and now you can correct them. If there's any that you were really stuck on, then use this video as a way to think through those problems. Today in class you talked about how to solve equations. Hopefully you talked about how you're going to draw a line down the middle of your equal sign and think about keeping both sides in balance. And whatever we do to one side, we need to do to the other. We also talked about combining like terms. So for example, we want to combine our x terms together and our number terms together so we can figure out what number goes with x. So let's start on this first one. We can kind of choose which way we want to go here. I'm going to subtract 2x from each side, kind of like subtracting two pouches, and I'll be left with 6 equals 4x plus 2. Now I'm going to subtract 2 from each side, and now I'm left with 4 equals 4x. I'm going to think about how I can get x by itself. So if I want to undo multiplying by 4, I'm going to divide by 4 on both sides. Now I have that x equals 1. And so now we want to do what's called a balance check and make sure that that's correct. So let's set up 2 times 1. Again, I'm plugging in my 1 for x, plus 6 equals 6 times 1 plus 2. And again, since I had 2 x's in this particular equation, I have to plug in that value 2 times. So now let's see if it's balanced. 2 times 1 is 2, plus 6. And then over here, 6 times 1 is 6 plus 2. And so I notice that 8 equals 8. That means my equation balances. Let's look at the next one. Drawing a line down the middle. And again, I'm going to try to get my like terms together. And maybe I would add 6x to each side. Again, you could start by combining the x terms together or combining the number terms together. And so here I get 8x minus 6 equals 2. Now I'm going to add 6 to each side so that I can get rid of the minus 6. That's with the 8x, because again, I want to get closer to having x by itself. So 8x equals 8. I'm going to divide each side by 8 so that I can get x alone. X equals 1. Looks familiar to the last one. So let's do a balance check and make sure it really works. 2 times 1 minus 6 equals negative 6 times 1 plus 2. So notice again, there's 2 x's in the original equation. I have to plug it in twice. So 2 times 1 is 2 minus 6. Negative 6 times 1 is negative 6 plus 2. And so I get negative 4 on one side and negative 4 on the other. Check. Third equation. Again, we're going to combine our like terms. So combining the x terms or combining the number terms. Let's start with the number terms first. So here, for example, maybe I would add 2 to each side. You could have also started by subtracting 6 from each side. So I get 2x plus 8 equals 6x. Now I'm going to subtract 2x from each side. And I'm left with 8 equals 4x. I'm going to divide by 4 to get x alone, and I get x equals 2. So let's do a balance check to see that it works. 2 times 2 plus 6 equals 6 times 2 minus 2. So 2 times 2, we've got 4 plus 6. 6 times 2, we've got 12 minus 2. And each side I get 10. 10 equals 10. Check. We're done. Let's look at the last one in this column. So combining like terms, again, you can kind of choose where you want to go. I could add 2x to each side. I could add 6x to each side. I could add 6 to each side. I could add 2 to each side. I can kind of choose how I want to start this problem. One way people sometimes like to think about it is, how can I get a positive x value? So again, that is an optional way to start, but maybe I want to add 6x here so that I can get a positive x value. So 6x plus negative 2x is going to be 4x minus 6 equals negative 2. Now I'm going to add 6 to each side so that I can get x by itself. 4x equals 4. I'm going to divide by 4, and I get x equals 1. I know we've had a few x equals 1 here. So we're going to plug it in to check on the balance check. Negative 2 times 1 minus 6 equals negative 6 times 1 minus 2. Negative 2 times 1, we have negative 2 minus 6. And negative 6 times 1, negative 6 minus 2. And both sides we get negative 8. Again, if you need to use your calculator, that's okay, but it's really good if you can kind of practice thinking through these integer operations, because integers are going to be a big piece of what we continue to see throughout the rest of the year, and also you're going to see in 8th grade algebra and beyond. Let's look at the next equations. Some of these are going to be more tricky, and these are going to involve what we call the distributive property. So you have options here. In this first problem, one option would be to distribute the 3 to each term inside. So we can make 3 times x into 3x plus, since there's a plus sign here, and 3 times 2, we get 6 equals 12. So now we can solve this just like a regular equation. I'll subtract 6 from each side. 3x equals 6. Divide by 3, x equals 2. That's one way to solve it. There's another way you could solve it that you might want to consider. 3 times the quantity of x plus 2 equals 12. So this is kind of like 3 times something equals 12. So another option would be to divide by 3 on each side so that you can, again, know that you don't have 3 groups of x plus 2, then you would only have 1 group of x plus 2, because 3 divided by 3 gives us 1. So we'd be left with x plus 2 equals 4. And then you could subtract 2 from each side and get x equals 2. So that's another way that you could solve that problem. Again, it's up to you which method you choose. Now to do a balance check. 3 times x, I think, is 2, plus 2 equals 12. So 3 times 2 plus 2 is 4, and I get 12 equals 12. Next, we're looking again at a distributive property, right? Distributive property has a number outside of parentheses. So it's again, it's your choice how you want to solve this. The strategy I'm going to pick here is to distribute the 3. And so I get 3x plus 6, just like before, equals x minus 18. And so now I'm going to subtract 6 from each side. Just one way to start. I get 3x equals x minus 24. Then I'm going to subtract x from each side so that I can get x's on one side. I have 2x equals negative 24. Divide by 2, and I get x equals negative 12. So now let's check. 3 times negative 12 plus 2 equals negative 12 minus 18. So 3 times negative 12 plus 2 is negative 10. Negative 12 minus 18 is negative 30. 3 times negative 10 is negative 30. So these balance out, we're good. 2 last problems. Again, one more distributive property here. 3 times x, 3 times 2, right? So 3x plus 3 times 2 is 6 equals 2x. So again, let's get our x's on one side, and I'm going to subtract 3x from each side. I get 6 equals negative 1x. You could also say 6 equals negative x, either way. But what you might be noticing here is that I want x to have a positive value. Doesn't mean that my answer has to be a positive number, but I want my x itself to be positive. So what I'm going to do is divide by negative 1 on each side. That's why it might help you actually to see the negative 1 in front of the x. Because negative 1 divided by negative 1 will give me a positive 1. And I'll be left with x equals negative 6. So let's check in our equation. 3 times negative 6 plus 2 equals 2 times negative 6. So 3 times negative 6 plus 2 is negative 4. 2 times negative 6 is negative 12. And 3 times negative 4 is negative 12. So our equations balance, we're good. Lastly, you have a challenge here. It's up to you if you want to try this one. But here's the answer if you want to check it. So you might notice some distributive property pieces here. Here's the tricky part. You have to make sure when you distribute this term that you distribute the negative with the 2. So this is going to become 5, and negative 2 times x is going to be minus 2x, and negative 2 times negative 1 is going to become positive 2 equals 12. So now we're going to do the same kind of stuff that we've been doing. I do see some numbers here that I can combine, a 5 and a plus 2. So I'm going to rewrite this as negative 2x plus 7 equals 12. Again, this is just part of combining like terms. Now I'm going to subtract 7 from each side. I get negative 2x equals, and 12 minus 7 would give me 5. Now I'm going to divide each side by negative 2. So I get x equals negative 2.5. You can write that as a fraction or a decimal. And we're going to double check our answer. So 5 minus 2 times the quantity of negative 2.5 minus 1 equals 12. So 5 minus 2, negative 2.5 minus 1 would give us negative 3.5 equals 12. And so looking at this here, 5, and then I have kind of like negative 2 times negative 3.5. So if I had 2 groups of 3.5, I would have 7. And it's a negative times a negative, so this becomes a positive 7. And so 5 plus 7, we get 12. 12 equals 12. We're balanced and we're done. So next week, be prepared to do more with solving equations. Be thinking about how the distributive property impacts the equations that we're solving. We're also going to move on to thinking about inequalities and how we solve those. So think back to greater than, less than, how we graphed those before, but we're going to add equations in with them. And then before you know it, we're going to be at your test. So just be aware next week we're going to do inequalities. We're going to have your review on next Thursday, and the goal is that your test will be on next Friday. We'll see you then. It's almost midwinter break.